If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are three things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first two steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Gosford Park so that we can study left brain stories. This 2001 film was directed by Robert Altman, from a screenplay by Robert Altman and Julian Fellows. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie, but I don't really think it's going to matter this week. To be honest, they're not huge spoilers this week. And please help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Just go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, click the 5 stars. It's that simple. Okay, Melanie, you chose Gosford Park this week. Lay it on me. Why did you choose this one?
Well, this was a rapid choice. This was not, as you know, this was not my original choice for this episode. I was actually going to choose The Constant Gardener. But because I didn't want to do 3 Le Carre stories this season, I thought I'd change this one. So I chose Gosford Park as the replacement. Because when I was reading about it, I thought, right, this is going to be right up our alley. This fits in exactly with what we're trying to achieve this season. And, it sort of was, but maybe not really. Probably not really. I think this movie really is a half social class commentary and half murder story. You know, the story was quintessentially a post-First World War English upstairs, downstairs drama. And, you know, the movie itself is full of the who's who's of English actors and actresses at the time it was made. So it's sumptuous and beautiful to look at and well acted. And as an aside, Gosford Park was actually Julian Fellows' inspiration for Downton Abbey. And if you look at the characters' names and some of the places and things like that, you'll see some surprising similarities between Gosford Park and Downton Abbey. Anyway, that's if you're into those sorts of period dramas, it's worth having a look at. Now, I'm looking at clues, motivations, and the murderers this season, but Gosford Park is not really much of a mystery to solve, and there's not really that much to look at in terms of the clues, the murderers, and the motives. You know, the puzzle was fairly simple to solve, although the cause of tension between Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Croft was a really good surprise at the end. And I enjoyed Mary's quiet but observant character putting all the pieces together, even though the formal investigation was unresolved because of, you know, Stephen Fry's wonderfully incompetent inspector. Anyway, so instead of diving into the 2 motives for murder, so the first one could have been money, which was really reserved for the upstairs mob. And the second was revenge, which was the currency of the downstairs staff. But that's what I would have looked at, but there's not much there. It's pretty obvious. So I wanted this week to explore the point of view options for the murderer, the victim, and the investigator, and what those choices mean for your story. So this week I'll start with the victim. You know, in Gosford Park, it becomes clear who the victim is going to be, even though it takes 1.5 hours for him to be killed. Sir William McCardle is wealthy. It's suggested that he's a predator, and he's generally unlikable. So we're not surprised or unhappy when he's killed. Now, there are a few things that accompany an unlikable victim. You know, it creates sympathy for the murderer or murderers, and their motive is usually quite obvious. It places pressure on the investigator because they have a moral dilemma. They have to pursue justice for someone who may have eluded it or who may not deserve it. And I say that in inverted commas. And usually it results in a long list of suspects that the investigator has to rule out. Gosford Park has 2 investigators, Inspector Thompson and Constable Dexter, who have little to no impact on solving the crime. Now, the 2 reasons they are in the movie, in my opinion, is because the police would have been called in real life, and their presence bolsters the point that Fellows is making about social class. The role of the protagonist, however, is taken by Mary, the Countess of Trentham's maid, and she is the one who watches and listens to the myriad of stories percolating amongst the downstairs staff. And she puts the 2 whodunits together and why it was done. Now, Mary, although she's young, she is the perfect choice for the protagonist. If she was police, she would have to charge Mrs. Wilson with murder. But Mary recognises that Robert, Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Croft, Elsie, and countless other women have suffered through Sir William's hands. Now, an unsympathetic victim does give the protagonist a moral dilemma, and it can give you the choice to use natural justice or formal justice. Now, I'm going to use Lynette from Death on the Nile as an example of a sympathetic victim. She was young, beautiful, and wealthy. She was kind enough and in love with her new husband. Some of the conventions that accompany a sympathetic victim are: it removes all sympathy from the murderer or murderers, and their motive is a mystery. It places pressure on the investigator because the moral dilemma is about seeking justice for the victim. And it usually results in the investigator trying to find the suspects and a motive, which is really powerful, I think, when you're trying to write a murder mystery story. Now, a slight variation on a sympathetic victim could be uncovering a double life or a vastly different public and private persona, which reveal motive and create tension in the investigator as their moral dilemma changes in the story. Now, let's look at some of the point of view options for the murderer. And one of the most important questions to ask yourself when writing a mystery is, are you going to use the murderer's point of view in your story? And if the answer is yes, then you need to understand what it does to the story if you let the reader into the mind of the antagonist. In Gosford Park, we meet the faux murderer, Robert, and the actual murderer, Mrs. Wilson. And while we don't spend a great deal of time with Robert, we do know that he's there to avenge his mother. We don't spend much time with Mrs. Wilson either, but she is far more sympathetic than Sir William. And I wouldn't say that Gosford Park is a great example of how to use the murderer's point of view in your story. But the book The Mermaid Singing by Val McDermid is an example of a story that includes the killer's point of view. And there are chapters in this book devoted to the killer speaking in first person. And this does 2 things. It allows us, the reader, to understand the killer's motives before the investigator does. And it also creates tension because the antagonist is usually in the process of committing a crime. Now, when the reader knows more than the protagonist, it's a form of narrative drive called dramatic irony. And the effect of knowing more than the protagonist creates conflict in the reader or viewer because they understand the difference between the protagonist's surface knowledge and the deeper knowledge about what's really going on. Understanding this difference creates tension in the reader because there has to be some resolution to the differences in knowledge. Now, remember also that tension is the anticipation that something will happen. Now, using the protagonist and antagonist's point of view sets up a cat and mouse plot in mysteries. One is on the hunt and the other one is evading capture. But eventually there also has to be a face-off. Now, The interesting and perhaps flawed part of Gosford Park is that there isn't a cat and mouse game. The late murder and ineffectual investigation don't provide a formal resolution to the mystery. The murderers aren't trying to evade discovery, even if they aren't shouting it from the rooftops. And as I mentioned before, it's Mary's observations that solve the crime, and she forgoes the opportunity to inform the police and the Countess about who killed Sir William and the reasons why. So there are stories like Along Came a Spider and The Fugitive, where we see the point of view of the victims and the investigators. And when the victim's point of view is presented, it ups the ante. This drives home what's at stake if the investigator doesn't solve the puzzle, or if the victim doesn't escape or solve the mystery themselves. In this type of story, the overall plot is centred, in my opinion, on a conflict triangle. There is a real balance of power between the victim, the investigator, and the antagonist, and it can be used deftly to complicate your plot in ways that maybe other story structures or points of view won't. Now, if you'd like to understand more about conflict triangles, then go back and listen to our episode on No Way Out from last season. And finally, they're seeing the mystery from the investigator's point of view only. The aim is to solve the mystery. The clues arrive via suspects, via the victim, and physical clues as they solve the mystery by sifting through the information, dismissing the red herrings, and putting 1 + 1 together to get 3. Now, the series Vera and Shetland, both based on the books by Anne Cleeves, are excellent examples of seeing the mystery through the eyes of the investigators and watching them solve the crimes. The book series Hamish Macbeth and Agatha Raisin are also good examples of flawed but fascinating investigators who solve crime in a way that no one else can. But ultimately, I think Gosford Park suffers from trying to present two external genres as primary genres at the same time. So it's not quite a murder mystery, and it really is, I think, an examination of the 1930s class system. But it's kind of incomplete because you've got the murder mystery going on at the same time. Anyway, Valerie, they're some of the things that I was thinking about while watching Gosford Park this week, and I'm a bit disappointed in my own choice. But anyway, I think it taught us, or it taught me a lot, and it got me thinking about other things to do with left brain stories. But what about you? What did you get out of this week's movie?
I'm a lot like you. I was surprised that I wasn't more in love with the movie because it has all the elements that I would normally fall in love with. But I didn't. I was just sort of waiting for William to be killed. I'm like, kill him already. Let's get moving. And that's what I want to talk about this week.
And there's so many people, isn't there, that could do it as well. And you just want them to go, oh, come on, just one of you make a decision and do it.
You're all thinking about it. Get on with it.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's what I want to talk about this week, actually, the inciting incident. Because I think Gosford Park provides us with a really wonderful opportunity to explore what the inciting incident is and why it's so important to a story. I have said this before, I'm going to say it again. If you've heard me before, hang in there. Stories have a nested structure. Think of Russian dolls. Melanie is laughing at me because she's tired of me talking about this. But anyway, I'm going to keep going. There are what's called units of story, and they usually sit one inside the other, right? Like Russian dolls, but sometimes they actually overlap. Now, each of these units of story works the same way, and they all start out with something called an inciting incident. So that means there are many inciting incidents in a story. Some are bigger, some are smaller, depending on which unit of story they are attached to. Now, what the inciting incident does is kick off action. It doesn't matter what kind of story you're writing, whether it's plot-driven or character-driven, there has to be some kind of physical action taking place. Otherwise, you are writing a story where a character is just thinking. And for modern audiences, whether it's someone reading a novel or watching a movie, that is not going to fly. That is boring, boring, boring. And today, in 2024, and it's going to get worse now as AI really comes online, we have the attention span of a gnat. We do. So if ruminating is all your protagonist is doing, your audience is going to check out immediately because they're bored, right? They have other things to do. They have other things to take their attention. They'll go play a video game on their phone or just doom scroll on their phone or whatever. Likewise, if you spend the first 100 pages of your book describing the fictional world, introducing characters through benign situations and interactions, or giving us a bunch of backstory through poorly executed exposition, your audience is also going to check out because they are still going to be really bored. Something needs to be happening. Okay. So even though stories have a nested structure and therefore have several inciting incidents, today I want to talk about just one inciting incident, and that's the story level inciting incident. In other words, the event that kicks off the whole book or the whole movie or the play, as the case may be. I've done a lot of study on this because I'm just like that. And in modern storytelling, the inciting incident, which is also called the global inciting incident, overwhelmingly shows up in one of two places. Okay? Either the global inciting incident is also the inciting incident of the beginning hook, which is Act 1, or the global inciting incident is the turning point of the beginning hook, or Act 1. And I'm talking 99% of the time in modern storytelling. This is what happens in stories that are working and that engage us and that we talk about and stand the test of time. So in the first case, where it's also the inciting incident of Act 1, it means that the inciting incident of the whole story happens very close to the beginning of the story. Often it's in the first chapter or the opening scenes of a movie. And if it's not, then it's happening, say, by chapter 3. I think anything later than chapter 3 is too long in a modern story. So if you're reading a book from the 1970s, it might not happen until chapter 5 or 6. Again, we had a greater attention span then. I'm talking about books that are being published now in the last couple of years and today, because you're writing your book now, it's not going to be published for a couple of years, right? Chapter 3 or sooner, if your global inciting incident is the same as your Act 1 inciting incident. Now, if your global inciting incident is the turning point of Act 1, you have a little bit longer time to introduce it. You still need an inciting incident to kick off your first act. It's just not the global inciting incident. Because remember, as I said, because stories have a nested structure, there are multiple inciting incidents throughout the story. So if it is the turning point, then the global inciting incident will happen anywhere between 15 and 25% into your story. These are rough numbers, but it gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. For a film, that means anywhere between the 15 and 30-minute mark. That's typically where it falls. You will find examples where that's not the case, of course. I'm just giving you guidelines. But, there are examples where the inciting incident happens later in a story. Absolutely. The question you should ask yourself, though, when you are writing your story or you're learning a piece of theory is not, can I do this in my book? But should I do this in my book? So what effect does putting a late inciting incident in your book, what effect does that have on the story as a whole, and what effect will that have on the reader? And Gosford Park is going to be the answer to that question. If we want to put our global inciting incident deep into our story, we really have to think about what happens. In season 2, we did Death on the Nile, the Kenneth Branagh version of Agatha Christie's novel. And let me read to you what I said at the time. Basically, what I said is that we're waiting too long for the murder to happen. And I said, I think Agatha Christie made it work in her novel, and she put the global inciting incident at the 37% mark of her story. So that meant there was still 63% of the story left for the whole puzzle solving. And we're here for the puzzle, right? Kenneth Branagh put the murder at 55%, or about an hour and 5 minutes into the movie. And that was a problem. Because the discovery of the dead body is the inciting incident for a murder mystery, and Branagh puts it in the second half of the movie, audiences have to sit through more than an hour of screen time with nothing happening, and it's really boring. Now, it's a beautiful movie, absolutely a beautiful movie, but there's no story happening. So Agatha Christie, she still had to hold her audience's attention for a really long time, and that was not easy, but one, she did have strategies for doing it. And two, Agatha Christie was a well-established name by the time Death on the Nile was published. So therefore, her readers trusted that she would deliver. It was worthwhile sticking with it because they knew the payoff would be great. And three, Death on the Nile was published 87 years ago, and the world was a very different place then. It was easier to hold a reader's attention because people had longer attention spans. That said, even though Agatha Christie's contemporaries were okay with the late start, our contemporaries, modern readers, are not going to be happy. The murder is still taking too long in that Kenneth Branagh film. Now, I should clarify something. I have been talking about the murder, but in fact, in a murder mystery, the inciting incident is the discovery of the dead body. It's not the actual murder taking place, it's actually the discovery of the dead body. In Death on the Nile and in Gosford Park, the discovery of the dead body happens very quickly after the murder. However, there are plenty of stories where the murder takes place days or weeks or even years after the murder has happened. One example is In a House of Lies by Ian Rankin, and it's actually a cold case where a body is found in a car, and the remains of a body is found in a car, and the murder happened, I think, 20 years before, something like that. So in Gosford Park, the discovery of the dead body, Melanie, you've already talked about this, it's an hour and 21 minutes into the film, which is the 65% mark of the story. Honestly, if I did not have to watch this film for the podcast this week, I honestly would have bailed. I would have. Because, unfortunately, until the body is discovered, there's nothing happening. Sure, people are arriving for a hunting party, but there's no plot. At first blush, Gosford Park is a movie that I should love, and I totally expected to love this movie because I love period films, especially those with the upstairs downstairs dynamic. It's filled with actors I love, and it's written by Julian Fellowes, who I like. But in this movie, until the inciting incident, we've got a lot of world building and we've got a lot of characters to meet, but that's it. The characters aren't doing anything of consequence or anything interesting. And I don't think there are very many working scenes. I didn't want to go through and count them because I would have gotten upset. I don't want to be upset. The other thing about having an inciting incident that's so deep in the story is you don't leave yourself any room for the investigation or for the puzzle. And the puzzle solving is what your audience came to your story for. Yeah, Melanie, you've talked about this. There is an inspector showing up. But he's such a bumbling fool that he really doesn't do much investigating. and he exits the stage before he has solved the crime. So there is really no chance of the guilty party being revealed to the fictional world. There is very little chance of justice being served. And murder mysteries, it shifts on justice, injustice. Now, what's interesting in Gosford Park is it does raise the question of what is justice, right? So you could say that there's an argument to be made that justice has been served, even though it's not justice in a criminal law or court formal system. It's kind of a social justice, I guess. Maybe a moral justice. Could I say that if somebody's been killed? I don't know. I don't think so. but I think you get my point. Now, because the investigator is so incompetent, it's up to the viewer to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And all the clues come from eavesdropping on the characters' conversations. And it is an easy crime to solve. But here is the problem. In a murder mystery, which is a crime story, the core event, the moment that we are building up to, is the exposure of the criminal. That's the justice being served part, right? And yes, here, the murderer is exposed to the reader, so that's fine. We find out who done it. But the murderer hasn't been exposed to the fictional world. And so we're left wanting. There's a little, it feels like it fizzles a bit at the end, like it doesn't pack a punch. It doesn't land the way we're expecting it to land. So I was a bit ambivalent about the end and lukewarm about it, because what I was expecting to happen, which is the exposure of the criminal, which is the big moment we're building up to, didn't happen. Now, way back in episode 1, I said that of the season, I said that left brain stories tend to be mysteries, crime stories, thrillers, and spy stories, but they can pop up in any genre. Now, whether they're a good fit for every genre is a whole different conversation, but it is possible. So when it comes to Gosford Park, there is a real argument to be made for it not being a murder mystery at all. And Melanie, you touched on this. This is a story about Mrs. Wilson getting her revenge for what William McCordle did to her and to their newborn baby. It could easily have been written with Mrs. Wilson as the protagonist. The problem with that approach, and with the existing presentation of Gosford Park, is that the left brain story concept doesn't fit well with it. Everything about this story as it exists is designed to evoke our emotions. The period, the costumes, the interplay between characters, the secrets, all of that appeals to our emotions, not to our intellect. And left brain stories appeal primarily to our intellect. They're puzzles to be solved. That's why we like them. So Gosford Park, to me, feels like a bit of a muddle. It's like the filmmakers, and it's so strange for me to say this with Robert Altman and Julian Fellowes' names attached to it, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I'm just that audacious, and I'm in that kind of mood right now. It feels like they didn't quite know what kind of story they wanted to tell. So they tried to tell everything rather than locking in on one thing. Now, I'm sure they knew they wanted to create a period drama, and I'm sure they knew that they wanted to explore the relationship between the aristocracy and the serving class, totally. And that is fine as far as it goes, but it isn't specific. And I think this is where they've run into trouble. In episode 1 of this whole show, we started out by saying that a story is about one thing, one specific thing. And Gosford Park is not, unfortunately. So, as much as I wanted to be blown away by this movie, I'm a bit disappointed. Now, I've learned a lot from my study this week, so that's good. That's all good. But it was more about learning what not to do as opposed to what to do. Anyway, That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Melanie, what have you got for the action step this week?
Yeah, we both learnt a lot from what not to do this week, or we went down different paths, didn't we, than what we expected. So I feel like I've gone on a bit of a tangent, and hopefully next week we'll come back again. All right, the action step. So as a writer, understanding the different impact point of view has on your mystery is important. When you watch stories like Gosford Park, take notice of what you're seeing and the impact it has on the overall story. Notice where your sympathy and empathy lie and ask yourselves, how does the writer create this? And most importantly, does it work in the context of what they're trying to achieve?
And that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss The Last of Sheila. And it's a good one. You really want to watch this movie before you hear the episode. Just trust me on this. If you like left brain stories, The Last of Sheila will make you happy. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on X, Instagram, and Threads at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to get Melanie's tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit her on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about her at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.